The first thing Sergeant Mara Voss noticed about the alien puppy was that it was using her boot as a pillow. She stood in the doorway of the decontamination bay, rifle still slung across her chest, dust from the Karath colony road still settling out of her hair, and looked down at the small gray creature curled against the heel of her left boot. It was roughly the size of a beagle. Its hide was a pale, hairless slate color, its four eyes closed, its breathing even, a thin iridescent membrane flickering over each eyelid as it dreamed whatever it was that Veth juveniles dreamed. It had somehow wriggled through the security mesh along the base of the eastern perimeter fence, and then chosen this particular doorway, this particular boot, as the most appropriate place in the known universe to take a nap. Mara looked at it for a long time. Then she sat down on the floor of the decontamination bay, back against the wall, and waited for it to wake up on its own. It didn't for almost 40 minutes. When it finally stirred, blinking all four eyes open in staggered sequence, first the upper pair, then the lower, it looked up at her without fear or surprise, as if it had always known she was there and had simply been deciding whether she was worth acknowledging. It made a sound like two smooth stones clicking together, once, twice. Yeah, Mara said. Same. That was 16 months before the war started. The Veth consolidation had not sent ambassadors. They had sent a signal, a single coherent burst of encrypted data, transmitted simultaneously to every orbital stations in 3 systems, decoded in under an hour by the AI translation cores at Karath Station. The message, once parsed, contained no greeting, no demands, no conditions. It contained a single piece of information, coordinates, and a single instruction: vacate. The coordinates were Sol. The instruction was self-explanatory. What followed was not chaos, not exactly. There was a period, perhaps 72 hours, in which the various human governing bodies, military commands, and civilian councils behaved with something like coherent urgency. Meetings were held. Plans were drawn. Messages were sent back along the same transmission frequency, asking for dialogue, for clarification, for time. The Veth did not respond. They were already moving. Mara was on Karath when the first Veth warforms entered the outer system. She had been stationed there for 2 years, attached to a joint biology security detail, studying the Veth in their natural habitat, peaceful work, or what passed for it at the frontier. She knew more about the Veth than almost anyone in the colonial military. She knew how they hunted. She knew how they communicated in the subsonic registers that human ears couldn't parse. She knew that they had a concept, encoded in the clicking, layered language of the consolidation, that translated very roughly as territory that has already been decided. A phrase that carried no aggression in Veth usage, simply a statement of fact the way humans might say Tuesday or North. Earth, apparently, had been decided. The evacuation order for the Karath research facility came 4 hours after the signal. 47 personnel, 6 months of irreplaceable biological data, and one small gray alien creature who had been living in Mara's quarters for the better part of a year, sleeping on her feet, eating reconstituted protein paste out of her hand, and occasionally staring at the wall in a way that made the facility's psychologist, Dr. Reyes, profoundly uncomfortable. She had named him Cato. She was aware of how that looked. The facility supervisor, a compact man named Burris, with the tight, perpetually disappointed expression of someone who had expected a different career, found her in her quarters at the 2-hour mark, packing her field kit. You can't bring it, Burris said from the doorway. Mara didn't look up. Mara. His name is Cato. He's vanilla still. He hasn't presented secondary traits. He can't defend himself in the wild, and if you leave him, he will die. The Veth warforms use chemical discrimination. They will scent him as unbonded and either kill him or assimilate him into a warpack, which is the same thing. She zipped the kit closed. So I'm bringing him. Burris stood in the doorway for a moment longer, calculating something behind his eyes, then turned and walked away without another word. Mara took that as permission. Cato was already awake, standing on her bunk with all 4 eyes tracking her movement, the clicking sound, 2 stones, then 3. In a rising pattern she'd come to understand meant something like alert but not alarmed. She held out her hand. He walked down her arm to her shoulder and settled there, his weight negligible, his warmth considerable. All right, she said. We're going. The evacuation shuttle was a Helix 4 transport, scarred from 2 previous emergency deployments, its interior smelling of hydraulic fluid and someone's long ago breakfast. 23 people sat in the main bay. The other 24 had taken the secondary shuttle 40 minutes earlier, including Burris, including Dr. Reyes, including the 6 months of biological data on 3 external drives that Mara had quietly transferred to her own kit before packing. No one spoke much during the ascent. The planet fell away below them, amber and gray in the afternoon light, its single moon a pale disk on the horizon. Cato sat in Mara's lap and watched the planet through the porthole with the focused, unreadable attention he gave to everything that moved. She watched the form signatures on the shuttle's tactical overlay as they cleared atmosphere. 14 contacts, still in outer system range, big contacts. Not the drone class she'd read about in the intelligence briefs, not the light patrol forms. These were something new. Something the briefs had labeled only with a mass estimate and the notation unclassified. Insufficient data. Mara was aware, in the quiet, steady way of someone who has already done the math and found it unpleasant, that they were probably not getting to Sol. She scratched behind Cato's primary ear ridge, the one just above his upper left eye. He made the two-stone click sound and leaned into her hand. They were intercepted 6 hours out. The Veth intercept vessel was a capture class, which meant they weren't planning to destroy the shuttle. They were planning to board it, secure the occupants, and process them through the consolidation's intake protocols. Mara knew what that meant. The other 22 people in the bay knew what it meant too, she suspected, though no one said it aloud. The pilot, a young man named Cho who had not spoken since liftoff, was holding a steady course with the careful precision of someone who understood that resistance was currently a choice between bad outcomes and worse ones. Mara made a different calculation. The shuttle had a med bay with a decontamination airlock. The decontamination airlock had a micro-atmosphere seal, designed to contain biological contaminants. The micro-atmosphere seal, if you were willing to do something genuinely stupid with the decontamination chemicals and the airlock pressure differential, could produce a directed burst of ionized gas at roughly 600 degrees Celsius for approximately 2.4 seconds, in a forward arc of about 30 degrees. It was not a weapon. It was the opposite of a weapon. It was a safety system that Mara was about to use as a weapon. She had 8 minutes before the Veth vessel completed its docking approach. She put Cato in the overhead storage locker, told him to stay. A command he understood, she'd trained him on it, a simple hard click pattern, and went to work. The other passengers watched her move through the med bay, with the combination of hope and skepticism that people in untenable situations reserve for anyone who appears to have a plan. She didn't explain herself. Explanations took time and she didn't have it. Petrov, the facility's structural engineer, a heavy-set man who'd survived 2 cave-ins and a bioscanner explosion, with the serenity of someone on excellent terms with mortality, appeared at her elbow 3 minutes in. "What do you need?" he said. "Hold this coupling here. Don't let go when the pressure spikes. Define spike. Enough that you'll want to let go." He held it. The intercept began. At the 4-minute mark, the Veth vessel's docking clamps engaging with a resonant thud that traveled through the shuttle hull and into the floor and into the soles of Mara's boots. She felt Cato shift in the overhead locker. Not panicked, just noting the new vibration with the careful attention he gave to everything unfamiliar. 2 minutes. The med bay hatch was directly adjacent to the docking port. That was the gamble. That was the whole thing. The Veth would breach the outer airlock, assess the shuttle's internal atmosphere for hostile particulates. Standard intake protocol. She'd read the procedure in the intelligence files. And then advance in a 4-unit entry formation through the corridor toward the main bay, moving exactly through the med bay hatch. She set the decontamination cycle and stepped back to the main bay. "Everyone get flat," she said. "Hands over ears." Nobody asked why. The Veth breach team came through the outer airlock with a sound like tearing sheet metal, and Mara triggered the decontamination cycle. 2.4 seconds of 600 degrees, in a 30-degree forward arc, through the medbay hatch, directly into the corridor. The sound was enormous, and then nothing, and then the emergency pressure vent screaming, and then an alarm she didn't recognize. Veth, she realized, from the intercept vessel, and then human voices, Cho shouting something, and then a secondary sound she had never heard before, a high descending tone from deeper in the intercept vessel. And she understood 3 seconds before anything happened that the tone was an abort signal, that the Veth vessel was disengaging. The docking clamps released, the shuttle lurched. Petrov fell against the bulkhead with a sound like a sack of wet grain. Mara grabbed the nearest handhold and watched the tactical overlay shift as the intercept vessel pulled back, its trajectory changing from capture approach to defensive withdrawal. It was not over. They were still in intercept range, still within weapons envelope of a vessel that was now, she was reasonably sure, re-evaluating its options. The abort signal meant confusion, not retreat. It meant damaged entry team, lost formation integrity, captain-level decision required. It meant approximately 4 minutes, while whoever commanded that vessel decided whether the cost-benefit calculation of re-engaging a damaged shuttle with an apparently booby-trapped interior was favorable. Mara used those 4 minutes. She pulled Kato from the overhead locker. He was unbothered, clicking in the 3-stone rising pattern she'd never fully decoded but which she'd come to associate with something like good. You're here. She held him against her chest for a moment, feeling his warmth, his heartbeat, the particular quality of his attention. Then she opened the shuttle's emergency external transmitter, the one meant for distress beacons, not communication, and she broadcast Kato's vocalizations on the Veth subharmonic frequency range. Not a message. She didn't have the language for a message. She had Kato sounds, the clicking, the layered tones, the subsonic registers she could feel in her sternum rather than hear. The sounds a Veth juvenile made, healthy and unafraid, in the presence of someone it trusted. She held the transmitter against his side and let him click. He clicked for 48 seconds. Then he stopped, cocked his head, and looked at the hull, toward the Veth vessel, with the focused, unreadable attention he gave to everything that interested him. The intercept vessel did not re-engage. It held position for 112 seconds, and then it turned, and it moved away on a vector that would take it back toward the Karath approach corridor. And it did not look back. Nobody spoke for a long time. Then Cho, from the pilot seat, what did he say to them? I don't know, Mara said. Something that mattered. They limped to the nearest coalition relay station, on thrusters and a prayer, 18 hours of careful navigation through the outer transit lanes, and they filed their report, and the report went up the chain, and somewhere in the chain it reached someone who understood that what had happened in that shuttle was not luck. It was not a coincidence. It was a data point. What Mara didn't know, and wouldn't for another 3 months, was that her transmission had been tagged by 3 separate Veth warform vessels in the outer system. Not targeted, tagged. Logged in the Consolidation's intake archives in a category she would eventually learn translated as approximately irregularity requiring review. She'd fired a jury-rigged decontamination burst at an alien boarding party, and then made an alien child's voice do the talking. The war, meanwhile, was not going well. The Coalition defense grid had performed better than expected at Ganymede, and considerably worse than expected at every other location. The Veth warforms had not engaged the way military modeling had predicted. They hadn't sought to destroy infrastructure or occupy territory. In the traditional sense, they had simply moved through, assessing, cataloging, shifting in formations that had no clear tactical purpose by any human doctrine, and apparently worked perfectly. 3 defense stations had been taken intact. 17 vessels had been lost. The number of human casualties was not something the briefings stated directly, which meant it was large enough to be strategically managed rather than absorbed. Mara had been recalled to Titan Station, debriefed 12 times, and assigned to an intelligence unit studying Veth behavioral patterns. The intelligence unit had 3 Veth biological samples, 4 hours of surveillance footage, and 200 pages of analysis from the Karath facility that Mara had brought out on her own initiative. And Kato. Kato had not been seized, contained, or handed to a research division. This was partly because the research division had initially tried to take him, and Kato had looked at the containment carrier with the dismissive patience of someone who had already decided not to, and the lead researcher had found herself, after 40 minutes of escalating containment attempts, sitting on the floor across from a creature that weighed 4 kilograms and was evidently winning. It had been decided with the quiet efficiency of institutions abandoning approaches that clearly weren't working, that Kato would remain with Sergeant Voss in an advisory capacity. Mara was not sure what Kato advised exactly. She had come to believe, in the way you believe things that you can't prove and wouldn't know how to write in a report, that Kato understood more about what was happening around him than any of the analysis could account for. He moved differently in certain rooms. Ears up, clicks more frequent, body angled toward things that weren't visible. He'd woken her twice in the middle of the night in the station quarters, standing on her chest, clicking urgently, and both times something had happened within an hour. Once a proximity alarm, once a power failure in the sector. She couldn't prove causation. She didn't try to. She started taking him seriously when he was anxious. 3 months after Kareth, the irregularity review flagged in the Consolidation archives produced something nobody had anticipated. A Veth envoy came to Titan Station, not a war form. An envoy, a single vessel of a class they'd never catalogued, unarmed by any sensor reading they could take, broadcasting on a frequency that matched Cato's subharmonic transmissions from the shuttle. It broadcast that frequency continuously for 6 hours before the Coalition command structure, in a session that Mara did not attend but was briefed on afterward, decided to let it dock. The envoy, it turned out, had questions, not demands, not conditions, questions. The Veth, she would learn this slowly, painfully, through a translation process that required Cato's active participation in ways she still didn't fully understand. Had a category of thinking around certain encounters, a special archive designation for events that did not fit known patterns. The irregularity category. The thing she'd done on the shuttle had landed in that archive, and the Consolidation's review process had, after 3 months of deliberation, decided that something landing in that archive warranted inquiry before it warranted resolution. They wanted to know what she'd done, not the decontamination burst. The Veth had understood that immediately, a standard improvised weapon, well within their modeling of human behavior under duress. They wanted to know about the transmission, the juvenile vocalization. They wanted to know what Cato was, what she was, what the relationship between them represented in human taxonomy. Mara sat across from the Veth envoy, large, gray, four-eyed, moving with the fluid, unhurried precision of a creature that had never needed to hurry, in the station's main conference room, with Cato in her lap, and she did her best to explain. Cato helped. He clicked at the envoy in patterns she couldn't follow, and the envoy clicked back. And at one point, the exchange lasted almost 20 minutes without Mara saying anything at all. She sat there, her hand resting on Cato's back, feeling the vibration of his vocalizations in her palm, and she waited. Dr. Reyes, who had come through on the primary evacuation shuttle and was now serving as the team's xenolinguistics consultant, leaned over at one point and whispered, "I think they're arguing about something." "They're not arguing," Mara said. She could feel the difference in Cato's posture, the absence of the tight, cord-like tension she'd learned to associate with distress. "He's explaining something." "What?" "I don't know. Something about me, I think." She thought of the first day, her boot, the sleeping creature who had never once, in 16 months of proximity, been afraid of her. She thought of what it must look like from the outside, this arrangement. The juvenile Veth who'd been left behind, who'd chosen a human, who'd learned to communicate in both directions, across a biological and cognitive gap that no member of either species had ever deliberately tried to bridge before. She thought about what Cato had clicked to the intercept vessel, 48 seconds of juvenile vocalization broadcast on the subharmonic range, and she thought about how the vessel had turned and left. And she thought about the category it had filed the encounter under, irregularity requiring review. Not a threat, not an anomaly to be eliminated, a thing that didn't fit, that needed thinking about. That was what she'd given them, not a weapon, not a negotiating position, something weirder and more human than either, an ambiguity they couldn't resolve without asking. The Veth had a word for that too. She'd eventually learn it. It translated roughly as a door left open. The translation protocols took 6 weeks to develop to functional level, working sessions that happened in a rotating order of participants, Mara, 2 coalition linguists, and always Cato, whose contributions could not be quantified but whose presence the Veth envoy had indicated, in terms that were not quite a request but weren't quite not one, was required. The envoy's name was a sound beyond Mara's range, but Reyes had taken to writing it as Veth 7 in the session logs, and that had stuck. Veth 7 was not friendly, precisely. It did not have the social architecture for what humans meant by friendly, but it was interested, in the way the Veth were interested in things that did fit, intently, methodically, without aggression. It asked about the boot. Mara told the story, and Reyes translated, and Veth 7 was still for a long time, and then clicked something that the translation protocols rendered as. The juvenile chose incorrectly and was not corrected. "That's not quite right," Mara said. "He chose what he needed. I didn't correct him because there was nothing wrong with the choice." Another in sim stillness. "Then, you considered his need." "Yes, you are not bonded pair, not kin group, not territory shared." "No, then why?" She thought about how to answer that and eventually said, "Because he was there and he needed something and I could give it. That's what we do, when we can." Reyes translated it. Veth 7 considered it for a very long time. The word the envoy used in response was one they didn't have a translation for. It would take another 3 weeks to approximate it. Something close to inexplicable generosity, or perhaps irrational care, or perhaps. And this was Reyes's final interpretation, offered quietly one evening after a long session: the willingness to tend something that isn't yours. Mara thought that was probably right. She thought about her mother, who had kept a garden in conditions that made gardening difficult, in a city that made it impractical, because she said that tending things was what you did when the world was hard, not because it solved the hardness, because it reminded you what you were. She didn't try to translate that, some things you keep. The negotiations when they came, and they came slowly, haltingly, with long silences and wrong turns, and 3 separate sessions that ended with Veth 7 withdrawing to consult with the Consolidation's remote review process, were not conducted on military terms. There were no territorial concessions, no force ratios, no deterrence calculations. The Veth did not recognize those frameworks. They recognized the irregularity archive, and they recognized that the irregularity at the center of the proceedings was Mara and Cato, specifically the nature of what existed between them, specifically the question of what it implied about humans as a category. The Consolidation had moved on Earth's system for the same reason it moved on any territory, because it had been decided, meaning assessed as uncontested, meaning no indication of a social or biological complexity that would register in Veth taxonomy as requiring consideration. Humans had appeared, in the Consolidation's intake data, as a species without the markers the Veth used to identify meaningful interior life. Not intelligence. The Veth had no particular reverence for intelligence. It was simply a property some matter had and other matter didn't. The markers they used were subtler. They were about the way a species related to the other things around it. Whether it tended, whether it chose, whether it stayed. The boot, the sleeping juvenile, the 48 seconds of transmitted vocalization over a weapon instead of after one. These were data points in an archive that said, look again. The negotiations lasted 4 months. At the end of them, Earth was not ceded. The Consolidation withdrew the warform vessels from the inner system. There was no treaty, exactly, because the Veth did not have a concept that mapped to treaty. There was an addition to the irregularity archive, a designated category for human space. A notation Reyes translated as, territory where the deciding is not yet done. It was not a victory, it was a pause. It was time, which was what they needed, which was what Mara had bought with a decontamination burn and a borrowed voice, and 16 months of small daily decisions that had, when assembled, made something neither side had expected. A relationship. Veth 7 left on a Tuesday. Mara stood in the docking bay, with Cato on her shoulder, and watched the envoy vessel undock with the smooth, unhurried precision that was the Veth's characteristic mode of moving through the universe, as if it had never been anything other than entirely at ease. Veth 7 paused at the docking port. It turned its four-eyed gaze toward Mara in the way she'd learned to read as a deliberate acknowledgement, something formal and considered. It clicked once, twice, a pattern she hadn't heard before. She looked at Cato. He clicked back the same pattern and then something additional. What did it say? Reyes asked. I don't know, Mara said. What did you say? She asked Cato. He looked at her with the focused, unreadable attention he gave to everything that mattered, and then he clicked once. A single smooth stone, a sound she'd catalogued months ago and never fully cracked, and leaned his weight against the side of her neck. Reyes stood with his translation notes and said nothing. Some things didn't need the notes. She thought about the garden, the way her mother's hands had looked in the soil, unhurried, doing something that was not efficient, and not strategic, and not measurable in any metric that mattered to the world outside that small patch of difficult city Earth. Doing it anyway, doing it, because the act of tending was its own argument, its own statement about what you believed the world was for. That was the thing the Veth couldn't model. Not the decontamination burst. Anyone could build a weapon out of a safety system if they were desperate enough. Not the transmission, that was improvisation, a known human variable they'd already accounted for. The thing they couldn't model was why she'd sat on the floor of the decontamination bay and waited 40 minutes for a strange creature to wake up on its own. Why she'd said, yeah, same, to something that couldn't understand her, and meant it. Why the small gray juvenile had grown into the creature sitting on her shoulder now, curious and calm and utterly unafraid, not because she'd trained it into trust, but because she'd offered it, and it had been accepted freely on both sides. The Veth had no word for that, not exactly. The closest they had was the one Reyes had finally settled on. The willingness to tend something that isn't yours. Humans had a shorter word for it. They'd had it for as long as they'd had words. It was the first word any child learned in any language, in any country, on any continent of the small, difficult planet that was currently, for the first time in 4 months, not facing an extinction-level military action. The word was kind, not clever, not strong, not adaptable, not tenacious, not all the things the war briefings listed when they tried to summarize human military advantage. Those things were real and had their place. But they weren't the thing that had opened a door in an alien archive that no weapon could have opened. The word was kind, and a sleeping animal on a boot, and 48 seconds of a child's voice broadcast into the dark between two species who had never meant to understand each other, and were now, haltingly, trying. Cato clicked again. The 3-stone rising pattern, alert but not alarmed, present here, attending. Yeah, Mara said. I know. She walked with him back through the station, through the corridors smelling of recycled air and bad coffee, and the particular anxious aliveness of a place where people were still figuring out whether they were going to survive. Someone nodded at her in the hallway. Someone else handed her a coffee without being asked. Petrov was in the mess hall with his arm in a sling, playing cards with 2 of the shuttle crew, and he raised the coffee he was holding when he saw her. A gesture that meant something between acknowledgement and gratitude, and we made it. All in the angle of one wrist. She raised hers back. Cato shifted on her shoulder, turning to look at something down the corridor with the focused attention he gave to the unfamiliar. She looked too. Nothing she could see. She'd learned not to assume that meant nothing was there. She waited. Down the corridor, past the junction, a door opened and a maintenance technician came out, humming something quietly to herself, and Cato relaxed, settling back against Mara's neck with the warmth and solidity of a creature entirely at home. She thought about all the small decisions that had assembled themselves into this moment. Every time she'd chosen to wait instead of push, to offer instead of demand, to tend something that wasn't hers. And she thought that, if she'd known, when she sat down on that decamination bay floor 16 months ago, where the sitting down would lead, she probably would have done it anyway. Not because she'd known it mattered. She hadn't known anything then. She'd just known that the creature was sleeping on her boot and that waking it abruptly seemed rude. She drank her coffee. Cato watched the hallway with his calm, 4-eyed attention, cataloging the world the way he always had, the way he always would, with interest and without fear, the way she had tried, imperfectly and persistently, to teach him by example that the universe could be approached. Outside the station, across 2 light hours of cold space, an alien archive had been updated, a category had been modified. A notation had been added in a language that predated human written history by 6,000 years, filed next to a record of a shuttle that had improvised a weapon out of a decontamination system, and then, instead of fighting, had made a child's voice do the talking. The notation would not translate cleanly. Nothing important ever did. But the closest rendering, the one Reyes would put in his final report 9 months later, the one that would be quoted in every subsequent diplomatic briefing, was something like this. Humans tend what is not theirs to tend. This is not a weakness. Somewhere in the outer dark, 14 warform vessels turned on, vectors that would take them away from Sol System. Their captains had received the archive update. They had reviewed the notation. They had processed the irregularity and reached the conclusion that the irregularity archive had been designed to produce. That something which did not fit the model required a different model, not the elimination of the something. They were Veth. They were patient. They were thorough. They would think about it for a long time. Humans, Mara had learned, were not patient, not particularly thorough, and never had as much time as they needed. But they were good at sitting on the floor and waiting for something to wake up. That, it turned out, was enough.